Hello guys, how are you? Well, this is the video in which we're going to have our tutorial specifically about the weeks that were unavailable before the first interruption of classes. So the idea is that we cover certain topics that are related to language acquisition. I know that let's say in these weeks of the assemblies and the marches and all these different things, I sent you a couple of workshops that were related to certain things that are a little bit different from what we're going to cover in this video. But that's basically because I wanted to get ahead of ourselves a little bit on those topics. So don't worry if you think that some of the things that we're going to talk about today are not precisely what are contained in those workshops, because we're going to deal with those hopefully in our next either presential classes or in another video tutorial that I would be preparing if necessary this week. So with this video I am sending an updated PowerPoint presentation. The idea is that we are going to be adding as usual certain different additional slides. So for the one that I am sending right now, I'm going to ask you to please go to the slide number 54, the one that starts with the title Phonological Development, right? It's this one that I have in here, just in case you don't see it or you don't locate it in there. The idea is that you follow my video with the presentation that we have in there. So if you remember correctly, we had I cover all the generalities of language acquisition from the from 0 months to the most let's say updated moment of growth, at least in the stages that we're going to be managing in the subject. And well, we distributed different things for your observations of the infants and stuff. So what we're going to do today is to go a little bit more in deep on each one of these different features that we have on the stages. Because let's say that these are things that you can also observe and add into your final work for your report, or just simply, if you think that by the moment the work that you have done it's enough or it has covered everything that was supposed to be doing, well, let's say that this is important for your general knowledge. So let's talk about of the phonological development on the period that covers vegetative sounds, vocal play, comfort sounds, all these different things. So during this period from 0 to 8, as you can see here, normally we're going to obtain an important degree of phonological development, the capacity of emit sounds and utterances, right? So as you can see in there, kids are able to control their lungs and the vocal tract, either by either for emitting sounds eventually to produce words, to control a little bit of their intonation, all different things that are going to become more complex in the future. But for now, let's say these are exercises in order for eventually, with this control, create more complicated reactions. In this phonological development stage also, they are going to be able to find distinctions between sounds, right? So here in the example we see that they are able to distinguish between ba and pa, for example, and these are just like two syllabical examples. But is it possible that they are able to do it with some other ones? Even sounds that have like no little, not really a big relevance for the language, for the target language, right? So let's say that that's why certain particular languages that are geographically located, we have talked about this in some other classes before, such as Japan and their possibility of let's say pronouncing this intermediate sound between the R and the L that it's so characteristic from their language, or like some other languages that are unable to pronounce certain vowels or that are composed almost entirely by consonants. Well, all these different things are important. Going into the next slide, number 55, we are going to see, well, that's a little bit of what I already mentioned. It's that by practicing or being able to articulate the movement, they are able to start to form their prosody. Remember that when we're talking about prosody, we're talking about these, let's say, units of language, right? That are, let's say, larger than syllables, for example, and that eventually are going to become linguistic functions, right? Such as intonation, stress, the tone, the pitch, the rhythm. So taking into account that this is a phonological development phase, well, they are going to be able to start forming this prosody that they are going to require and use. Now, during this stage, you will see some, let's say, different occurrences of events, such as the simplification, right? So we have sort of the possibility of producing short strings of words, connected words, or simplified sentences, as we will see in later stages, right? So, for example, that can happen with consonants, as you can see in the example, right? We have some words such as bowl or stop. That is the way in which they are supposed to be correctly pronounced. And nevertheless, the infant tries to simplify it. So he omits sort of the ending consonant, right? So he's going to say bow instead of bowl, or top instead of stop. So as you can see, he can omit either the final consonant or the initial consonant. Also, we are going to see a lot of different possibilities of combinations of simplifications of syllables, right? So we have like some moments in which the kid just eliminates a certain syllable because the word is too long, so it's too complex for him at the moment. Or we are going to see how they reduce the complexity of syllables by omitting a sound that it's difficult for him to pronounce at the moment. Or maybe he's going to repeat syllables, just like in the reduplication example that we see the other day, that we saw the other day. So they just repeat a particular syllable that it's easy for them to pronounce. And well, there are different examples that we can get in there. And here in the slide, you can see let's say an example that we have in here with the word tomato, and how they are able to say, for example, mato or mato instead of saying tomato or tomato. So they eliminate the first syllable, that it's toe. The same happens with the elimination of an intermediate consonant that is, of course, is going to give a sound that it's difficult to reproduce at the moment, such as cheap, right? So it's very likely that an infant might be able to say something like sip, because the sound it's difficult to be uttered by him. So that's in terms of phonological development. If we go into the next one, we will see the morphological development, right? So in the slide 56, you will see a short reproduction of a very famous infant experiment in which they were given what seems to be a couple of birds, something similar, and they were given the word, the name, sorry, WUG, W-G, right? As you can see, there's even the phonetic pronunciation in there, the phonetic writing, and of course the word WUG does not exist. It doesn't have any particular reproduction in the real world, so it's just basically a made-up word. Nevertheless, they were shown first one of these WUGs, one of these one of these birds, and eventually they were started being shown pictures of groups of these different animals, right? Eventually they came up with the rule of adding an S at the end of the quantity of birds. So the first one that was individual, they call it the walk. And then when they were shown pictures of 2, 3, 4, 5 different animals, so they immediately or automatically added the word s, meaning that they pluralized the word. Even if it was a made-up word, a word that didn't exist, well, they were able to, let's say, reproduce this morphological structure. It's also curious to see how there's a certain order in the acquisition of the morphological development, the morphological characteristics of words. So we will see that, and that will be interesting that you observe these kind of things, of course, depending on the kids that you may eventually observe, or just simply when you have the possibility of having contact with other kids, not necessarily as an academic assignment. You will see that more or less there's a typical order in which they develop their language. So we will see that most of the times kids are going to start developing structures of present progressive, the continuous. It's one of the first things that they are going to be acquiring, being followed by prepositions, by plurals, by possessives, determinism, and some other different things related to the grammar in here. So it's consistent. Let's say that by means of different experiments that they did and observe. Well, experiment is a polemic word, so let's call it observation. Um, by means of very different observations that they did on infants, it was possible to determine that in a very high percentage, this was the order, with few variations in which they are able to acquire these particular features of the language. Now let's talk about the syntactic development, right? Over here, let's say that we're going to be focusing on this stage from 9 months to 25 or so. And we will see how, even though we talk about this, let's say that there are specific syntactic features in the different utterances that they have. So if we go into the slide number 59, you're going to see one word utterance, two word utterances, and the telegraphic speech. So as you can see in the first case, the one that's in red, they are talking about those individual words that bear a single meaning, right? So they normally refer to either objects, people. Usually we're talking about nouns most of the times. When we're talking about two-word utterances, we'll see that the let's say the communication, it's a little bit more complex in terms of doing requests, asking questions, making suggestions, and things like that. That is much more complex in terms of syntax and meaning than just let's say the utterance of a single word. So we have here something like one cookie, like I want cookie, and this, because of the inflection of the prosody that we talked some minutes ago, can become I mean, it can be a request, can be a question, can be an affirmation. Well, there are like an offering, different things. The same with word daddy. Now, telegraphic speech that we have already mentioned this some classes ago. Well, it's definitely more complex. Now we have cat drink milk, man ride bus, and all these different things that are just a step away from being complete sentences. And they are clear enough for us to understand in a very good way what they're trying to say. Now, let's say that those are some of the elements that are attached into these phases or stages of language acquisition. I would like to talk about right now about the driving forces of language development. Um, what are those factors or those ideas or those variables that motivate or that can foster or be an obstacle for the development of the language in the infant? So as you can see there in the page, in the slide number 60, we got them divided into two different groups. The red one that has to do with positive evidence, imitation, and reinforcement. And then a second one that it's child-directed speech and innateness. We talked about innateness a while ago too, and basically we asked questions about it and said like, do we come equipped naturally with that, or there's more like of an empiric process? So the idea is that we talk a little bit about that. So basically, we will see if you go in the slide number 61, is that there's a position that seems to be very evident and very obvious. Nevertheless, in all of the three cases that we will verify or witness in a minute, um, you are going to realize that the pattern is the same. This variable seems to be really, really important, and sometimes obviously necessary for certain things. Nevertheless, it turns out to be that there are some objections into the definite importance of that, right? So first of all, let's talk about positive evidence, right? And it's basically how can a kid may be motivated to learn the language and to use the language, to acquire the language, because of the exposure that he has to the language. So it seems to be, again, like pretty evident that we require to see other people speaking the language, using its rules, mm, let's say, providing a particular way of pronouncing, of having intonation, and all these different things. It seems like pretty evident that we require this in order to start speaking ourselves. Um, of course, let's say that this is true because there's something that it's undeniable in most of the cases, at least, and it's that comprehension precedes production. Like, we're required to understand and to see the interaction of other people, and to see what is the effect of language in their interactions of adults or people around us, or even if there's only a single person that it's taking care of the baby, of the infant. Well, it's necessary, um, by principle, that this infant starts understanding how is it that the language works before he can actually um, produce some sort of utterance, word, and eventually sentence. Um, that's pretty clear, right? Nevertheless, there are like some objections into this, right? Let's say that exposure is important, but does not really guarantee that the child, or even a grown-up person, and that's when we're going to be talking about in the future, in the near future, about second language acquisition. Um, it's that exposure does not necessarily guarantee the acquisition of the language. Not by meaning by being immersed in a English speaking country, you are going to magically absorb the skills and abilities that are necessary to speak the language yourself. Um, so that is like one thing. The other aspect is that this exposure does not necessarily need to be direct, right? It's let's say that it can be done by different media, by music, by television, by some other sources rather than the physical person, the physical presence of the persons of the guardian or parent that will be taking that into account. So that's, let's say, one of the driving forces. Sure, exposure, being able to have the positive evidence of somebody else, right? Um, then, if we go into the slide number 62, you will see that we have imitation. One more time, it seems to be pretty evident that we're required to imitate, exemplify, just sort of mock, um, and reproduce the behaviors, words, utterances, noises, accent of other people. And it seems that that is unquestionable. Nevertheless, imitation is pretty important in terms of pronunciation, of intonation, of all the other things that I mentioned before. Nevertheless, there are certain things that tell us that imitation, being important, uh, is not the only thing that can guarantee the acquisition of a language. Why is that? Well, first of all, because of mistakes. You will see that one in the slide. Um, if imitation was enough to do that, children wouldn't have the possibility of making mistakes, because 90% of the cases, most of the cases, uh, let's say, grown-ups, adults wouldn't make these kind of mistakes in their day-to-day speech, right? So we have something here like in which the child says, "Mama is a boy, he a girl," right? So he's making the mistake of she instead of sorry, he instead of she. The same like daddy wanted home. So he's using the rule of regular verbs, wanted, um, because of course he doesn't know yet the idea of the irregular verbs. So let's say if it was that simple, kids wouldn't replicate these mistakes because simply adults don't make them. Second, creativity. There are certain things that children come up with, names for objects, animals, places, utterances that sometimes just simply make no sense, or make sense only for their own code of conduct and their own kind of language, but that were not acquired really by trying to imitate anybody. Yes, it's just maybe a babbling sound that was successful in the past, and they just continue replicating that. So imitation in here is question, right? And of course we have, let's say, these imitation problems, right? In which the adult can try and model the communication of the kid, and his grammar structures and her syntax and, well, different things, but the kid will not be able to correctly imitate that model until he is in the corresponding stage, or he, let's say, develops the required verbal tense that is associated to his or her speech. So here we have here something like the adult saying he's going out, and the child just says he go out, right? Because he still doesn't have the possibility of using this particular verb tense, or has not been given this rule or different things. And then let's talk about word order. Let's check the second example. It says the adult says, "Say what I say," right? So he's trying to making him model it specifically and say word by word what he's going to say. Say what I say. Where can I put them? And then the child answers or repeats where I can put them. So there's a problem, if you want to call it that way, in word order that the kid is not going to be able to deal with until he, let's say, reaches the stage of development that requires this comprehension of rules. So as you can see, imitation is important, but questioning certain things, just like the case of positive evidence. Going further, we have reinforcement, and here we come one more time. As you can see, all our topics are connected, right? At the beginning, we're talking about behaviorism and Skinner and Pavlov and all these guys that had to do at some point to deal with strict or more flexible behaviorism. And basically this reinforcement, it's about strengthening, reinforcing, and shaping a particular behavior, right? So if me as an adult, I decide that I want my kid to be well, to have particular language proficiency, so it seems to be easy, no? I just simply reinforce or give positive reinforcement when the kid says something that it's grammatically and syntactically and, let's say, in general, correct, and I correct or provide some slight punishment, or I just make repeat the kid if he provides a structure that is not correct, or that is not the one that I'm expecting. So here we have a couple of examples that are really simple, such as the child saying "that's a dog" and the adult saying "yes." So that's positive reinforcement, a pretty simple example. And then in the negative, it says she holded the baby rabbit. So one more time, we have the rule of regular verbs applying to an irregular. He's not able to understand that, so the author corrects. He says, no, she held the baby. He probably used this tone of voice, right? With a higher pitch, with a more emphasis, saying, no, he held the baby right. So that's the negative reinforcement. So if language worked that way, well, it would be, let's say, kind of easy. It would be a matter of providing reward or just correcting. Nevertheless, we have here some problems that one more time, or let's say questions that make, let's say, let us doubt about the exclusive effective effectiveness of reinforcement, such as sometimes you correct meaning and not form. Seeing here this example in which the child said, there's the animal farmhouse, right? And he's pointing at something different. He knows the appearance of the place, but then probably in his vocabulary it was not that word, so he's using a different one. A farmhouse, a place where there are horses and um, cows and all these different things. Nevertheless, he's referring to what? As you can see, the adult corrects. No, that's a lighthouse. So as you can see, language itself, the grammar, the words, the nouns, everything that's in here, the verbs, it's correct, right? So it's only the meaning, uh, of course, and this is a big mistake. Let's say, comparatively speaking, there's a lot of difference between a farmhouse and a lighthouse. So this negative reinforcement, although you can correct sometimes these different things, well, it's not going to fit into the reward punishment option that we have in here. Then the second thing is the early comprehension. So sometimes happens that a kid, as we mentioned in a couple of slides before, that he's able to comprehend, to understand certain things, and he got it right the first time, right? He doesn't need any sort of correction, he doesn't need any sort of punishment, and he doesn't need any positive reinforcement. Because of the observation process, is it possible that one or two or three uses of the language or words or different things, he is able to learn it correctly from the moment of reception. So no reinforcement is required in here, as you can see. Um, Again, the next one, it's the occurrence of the problem. Let's say that sometimes a certain reward or punishment or correction requires that the kid makes the mistake, and or sometimes she requires a situation, a context in which she is able to use that particular set of words. So if that context never arrives, if it never happens, well, let's say that reinforcement, either positive or negative, is not going to be possible, right? Just open a dictionary, look for a weird or strange or not very common word, and you will see that chances are that if you don't know what is the meaning of that word and that you have never had the occasion of using it in a conversation, it is very likely that you, number one, either use it in an incorrect way and you were never given the chance to have the reinforcement, or two, you use it, let's say by chance, let's call it that way, in a correct way. Or maybe you can guess what is the meaning or something like that. My point here is that if the situation does not come up, well, there's never going to be a chance to reinforce neither positive nor negatively. Finally, let's talk about acquisition strategies, and this is a little bit what happened with the same example that we gave a minute ago about went, goat, went, and it's that sometimes happens that some parents or some tutors of any nature um, do not really provide positive or negative reinforcement. They prefer that the kid um, develops his language at his own length and pace, because they are afraid to pamper him, or spoil him by celebrating every single victory that he has, or they are afraid of making him scared and making him frustrated. That's why they don't either correct or punish. Nevertheless, at some point, be it school or be in the let's say a television program, or simply by listening to the grown-ups, he's going to automatically change his mistake. He's going to change or go from goat into went with no external source that told him that that was incorrect, right? Or even if he was able to notice that or to check that, or somebody told him, it was not presented in the way of reward or punishment. It could be just some sort of external information. So these are like the buts, the objections to reinforcement. As you can see, those were like the three first elements that we were going to talk about. Let's finish then this presentation with the final two elements or driving forces, that are the first of all, the child-directed speech. That's on the slide number 64. As you can see, initially this was called motherese or baby talk. Eventually, let's say that it was given a more professional name, a more let's say factual, in terms of let's say the idea that it's not the mother the only one that it's going to be in charge of stimulating or creating these kind of things, or well, it's not only the baby. Let's say that infants at a later stage they can also use it. Well, the CDS in here is the academic acronym that is normally used, Child Direct Speech, CDS. Those are the initials. Well, let's take a look at some of the characteristics in here. There are this child-directed speech that, one more time, remember that we're talking about the driving forces, let's say the important factors that it makes a kid to advance into his language acquisition process. So this CDS, it's going to be phonetically different, as I mentioned. It has a different higher speech, or probably it has a more acute one, or well, there are a lot of different ways in which parents communicate with the kid, but in terms of phonetics, it's different, or maybe slightly or completely, from our day-to-day speech. It's slower and shorter, as I mentioned. It's tried to be simplified. Um, let's say that the inflections, when we're talking about he, she, it, um, they are not so important, especially in the early stages, right? So if a parent decides like to make mistakes in the reproduction of his language, like for example, not adding an s in the third person, or something similar, it's going to be, let's say, acceptable in this CDS. Also, take a look in, let's say, the in the possibility, or the common occurrence in the fact of using nouns or names instead of the pronouns. Yes. So, for example, a parent would not say, I am here with you, but daddy is here with you, dear, or something like that. So as you can see, they tend to replace these pronouns for more specific words that the infant can relate to. Vocabulary, of course, well, it's going to be amplified every time it's possible, but the idea is that, let's say, depending on what the kid is learning or having a relationship with at the most immediate moment, that is going to be the case, or that is going to be the vocabulary that is going to be used. Again, we have, well, baby words, so some words that may not exist by themselves in the common language, such as moo moo, to talk about the cow, for example, like reproducing the sounds of the noise of certain elements, or the noise of the engine of a car. Well, all these different things that are going to be practical and easily associated. And it's clearly segmented. Basically, there's an family of words, utterances, and sentences that are used to communicate the baby about certain aspects very specific aspects of his life. So there are, let's say, a set of vocabulary for the time of sleeping, for taking a bath, for being fed, for expressing later on his requirement to go to the bathroom. Well, all these different things, and they are pretty much chunks of vocabulary and expressions that go in there. Finally, let's finish with the innateness. Let's say that this can also be described as a driving force in the language acquisition because of the let's say the opposition that we have between two ideas that actually this was in one of the readings that you used for the previous workshops, and is the nativist approach versus the empiricist approach. So those group of scientists and researchers and linguists and psychologists that are completely convinced that there's some sort of an automatic system that it's wired into our brains and bodies since birth, and then there's this other group of scientists and linguists and academics and scholars that says that it's basically by experience that we're able to do this. As you can see here, there are a couple of let's say, reflections. That language capacity is present from birth. That we have something that's called like a language acquisition device. That's something that's presented by the theory of universal grammar. We are able to communicate in a particular way, in no matter the language or no matter our place of birth, and that there are certain parameters for that. So I'm not going to go really deep in this final slide because that's part of our next topic. And again, I think that you already read a little bit about that to complete in the previous workshop. Nevertheless, let's say that it's very important in this part, or it's included in here, because it is undeniable that there's a very important part of us that has an innate or a let's say an automatic way of learning, reproducing, and amplifying the language since our birth, but there's also a very important role in experience. So that's why it's important in here. So that was it, guys. Let's say that our video until today is this way. If you have any additional question, if you require any additional assistance, please let me know. As you can see here, there are a lot of ideas that you can implement for your observations. Some other aspects that probably were too generally explained last time, and here are a little bit more in detail, and they are more observable about the, for example, the reduction of syllables and the simplification, all these different things. So that's it, guys. Hopefully we will be seeing each other in class to continue with the rest of the topic, or if necessary, so I will be just sending another virtual lesson. So thanks a lot, and hope I'll be seeing you soon. Have a good day. Bye bye.